heart of Japan's steel industry. The raid was symbolic rather than strategic. Many bombs missed, scattered by high-altitude winds and primitive navigation equipment. Yet when the fires burned that night in Iwata, it sent a message to Tokyo that echoed far louder than the explosions themselves. Japan's homeland, untouched for centuries, was no longer beyond reach. But the price was ruinous. The China-based B-29 missions drained resources faster than they produced results. Every gallon of fuel burned by a bomber required 10 more to be flown in by transport. Maintenance in primitive airstrips was nearly impossible. Pilots returned exhausted, and engines failed under strain. General Arnold and his commanders knew it could not continue. If the United States wanted to bring the war to Japan's doorstep, it needed new bases, islands close enough for massive repeated raids, yet far enough to remain secure from Japanese counterattack. That opportunity came from the U.S. Marine and Army assaults on the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, in the summer of 1944. The battles were savage, fought inch by inch against defenders ordered to die rather than surrender. But when the smoke cleared, the Marianas were in American hands. Engineers immediately began transforming the islands into the largest airbase complex in history. Airstrips stretched over coral plains, long enough for the heaviest bombers on Earth. From here, Japan's cities lay within striking distance. 1,500 miles away, a direct route across open water. As the first B-29 squadrons transferred from India to these new Pacific fortresses, Japan's generals studied maps and altitude charts in disbelief. The Americans were building something beyond their comprehension. A machine that could rise above the reach of every interceptor and anti-aircraft gun they possessed. They did not yet understand it, but the conquest of the Marianas had sealed their fate. The age of unreachable bombers was about to begin, and Japan's skies would soon become the most dangerous place on Earth. When the first B-29 Superfortresses arrived on the newly captured islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the autumn of 1944, they represented the most powerful concentration of air power the world had ever seen. The U.S. Army Air Forces poured men, machines, and fuel into the Marianas at a scale no nation had attempted before. Construction crews worked around the clock, turning scorched battlefields into vast concrete runways, stretching more than 2 miles long. Fuel pipelines snaked across jungles. Maintenance hangars rose like small cities. In a matter of months, these islands became floating fortresses, unsinkable aircraft carriers from which the United States could now strike directly at Japan's heart. The B-29 itself was unlike anything the Japanese military had ever faced. It flew at altitudes over 30,000 feet, higher than the operational ceiling of almost every Japanese fighter in service. It carried a bomb load greater than 4 B-17s combined, and cruised faster than the most modern enemy interceptors. Inside its sleek fuselage, a pressurized cabin allowed crews to fly above the freezing airless stratosphere in relative comfort, connected by a narrow tunnel that stretched through the bomb bays. For the young American airmen who stepped into this machine, it felt less like an aircraft and more like a glimpse of the future. To the Japanese defenders, however, the first sight of a B-29 was something closer to disbelief. They called it the B-son, a mysterious silver intruder that appeared at impossible heights, glinting in sunlight far above the reach of their guns. Their most famous fighter, the Mitsubishi A6M0, could climb high, but only briefly and with its engine gasping for air. The newer Nakajima Ki-44 and Ki-84 could approach the B-29's altitude, yet their performance there was unreliable, their weapons ineffective. Engines overheated, wings iced, and pilots lost consciousness in the thin oxygen. Even when they managed to reach the bombers, the B-29s defended themselves with remote-controlled turrets, guided by advanced computing gun sights, a concept that seemed unreal to Japanese engineers. From their command rooms in Tokyo, Japanese generals began to realize the full scale of the crisis. Radar operators reported intrusions they could barely track. Anti-aircraft batteries fired blindly into empty sky, their shells bursting far below the bomber streams. Frustration turned to fear as reports arrived of industrial targets burning in Nagoya, Osaka, and Tokyo. The once proud Imperial Air Defense Command found itself powerless to protect the capital. The problem was not bravery. It was physics. Japan's wartime industry had never produced a high-altitude turbocharger capable of sustaining power above 25,000 feet. Their aircraft engines were limited by design and materials. Even their best interceptors stalled or froze long before reaching the B-29's cruising level. No amount of training or heroism could overcome that gap. In military terms, Japan's entire defense network had become obsolete overnight. Meanwhile, the Americans refined their strategy. At first, their high-altitude precision raids were plagued by crosswinds and mechanical failures. Bombs drifted off target, fuel leaks, caused fires, and newly built airfields suffered from soft coral runways that shredded tires. But the learning curve was steep, and American industry ensured replacements arrived faster than losses occurred. Each month brought new formations, new techniques, and new confidence. General Haywood Hansel, commander of Saito 1 Bomber Command, believed in daylight accuracy. He ordered attacks against industrial sites and aircraft factories, using the Norden bomb site to aim from extreme altitudes. The results were mixed but improving. Japanese observers noticed something chilling. Despite the dangers and the distance, the raids never stopped. The Americans always came back, higher, stronger, and in greater numbers. By late 1944, Tokyo's military leaders faced a grim truth. For 3 years, Japan had fought an empire of islands. Now it faced an empire of air. The skies above the Pacific no longer belonged to the Zero. They belonged to the Superfortress. Japan's vaunted defensive perimeter, once stretching across the Pacific, had collapsed into its own atmosphere. In the cold, thin stratosphere above Japan, the war had entered a new dimension, one in which altitude itself became the ultimate weapon. The B-29s ruled that invisible battlefield, and the generals on the ground could do nothing but watch. The B-29 Superfortress was not merely a bomber. It was a statement of technological dominance. At a time when most nations were still refining propellers and piston engines, the United States had leapt into an era of near science fiction. Each B-29 carried an engineering complexity rivaling a naval destroyer. Inside its gleaming aluminum skin, every system was a marvel of innovation. Pressurization, central fire control, analog computing gun sights, and turbo-supercharged engines that could maintain power far beyond the breathable atmosphere. It was not just a machine of destruction, but a symbol of how industrial strength could bend the laws of air warfare. To those who saw it for the first time, it appeared less like a bomber and more like an instrument built to command the sky itself. For its crews, however, the aircraft was both a fortress and a test of endurance. Flying the B-29 was a battle between technology and human fragility. Missions stretched over 10 hours, covering thousands of miles of open ocean. At cruising altitude, the outside temperature dropped to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost formed inside the windows, oxygen masks froze, and any breach in the pressure system could mean instant death. Inside the cabin, the airmen lived in a fragile bubble of warmth and steel, surrounded by humming engines and the constant vibration of flight. They trusted the intricate web of systems that kept them alive, and feared the moment one might fail. Many of the men who flew these missions were barely out of their teens. They were trained in the newest instruments, yet each sortie carried the weight of unknown danger. When the first formations left the Marianas, few could imagine what awaited them over Japan. They flew above the clouds, often beyond visual range of their targets, guided by radar operators reading glowing screens in dimly lit compartments. Below them stretched the endless blue of the Pacific, and far ahead, the volcanic peaks of Japan emerged like ghostly shadows. There was beauty in the view, but it came with an unspoken understanding. They were flying into history. For the U.S. Army Air Forces, the strategy behind these flights was clear. The B-29s represented a new kind of warfare, one that sought to destroy not armies, but the industrial heartbeat that sustained them. American planners believed that precision bombing could cripple Japan's capacity to fight. By hitting steel plants, aircraft factories, and power stations, they hoped to cut off the war at its source. The concept was simple, but its execution depended entirely on altitude. The higher they flew, the safer they were. The thin air reduced drag, increased range, and kept them beyond reach of enemy guns and fighters. The B-29's pressurized cabin and advanced superchargers made it possible. Altitude became armor. Yet that same altitude turned every mission into a challenge of physics and faith. Bombs released from 6 miles above often drifted miles off target due to unpredictable winds. Clouds obscured visual aiming, forcing bombardiers to rely on radar images that resembled abstract patterns. Many crews returned without knowing if their bombs had struck anything of value. Still, each mission gathered data, refining tactics, mapping wind currents, and adjusting formation spacing. Every flight was an experiment in the future of warfare. For the Japanese defenders, these raids were unlike anything they had ever faced. The enemy no longer approached at low or medium altitudes, where anti-aircraft guns and interceptors could engage. The B-29s floated in a realm that seemed untouchable, like celestial machines operating above the reach of mortal hands. Fighter pilots scrambled, but by the time they reached 25,000 feet, their engines gasped and their guns froze. They fired into empty air, watching vapor trails vanish into the sun. The frustration was unbearable. One Japanese ace described it later as trying to shoot at the moon. Commanders across Japan's air defense network demanded answers. They experimented with stripped-down aircraft to climb higher, removing armor and fuel to lighten weight. They installed rocket-assisted boosters and tried desperate ramming tactics. None worked consistently. Even when a fighter managed to intercept a B-29, the bomber's defensive firepower was overwhelming. 4 remotely controlled turrets, each guided by precision optics and computing sites, could track and destroy attackers long before they closed in. To the Japanese pilots, it felt as if the bombers were guided by unseen intelligence, guns that aimed themselves faster than human reflexes. While the Japanese struggled, the Americans continued improving their tactics. They adjusted bombing altitudes, switched to nighttime operations, and experimented with incendiaries for maximum destruction. Each new method evolved from data gathered on previous raids. Technological adaptation became the Americans' greatest strength. Engineers in the Pacific worked side by side with pilots, redesigning components between missions. The war in the air was no longer decided by courage alone. It was determined by who could innovate faster. Behind the numbers and the technology, there was a deeply human side to these missions. Many of the airmen struggled with the moral weight of their task. From such heights, the destruction below seemed unreal, distant, almost abstract. They dropped thousands of pounds of bombs on cities they could barely see, knowing only that somewhere beneath the clouds, people lived and died. For some, that distance made it easier. For others, it haunted them for the rest of their lives. The B-29C. Pain was built on contradictions. Safety at altitude, but danger at every takeoff. Technological mastery, but moral uncertainty. Overwhelming strength, but invisible vulnerability. It was a war fought not just between nations, but between altitude and gravity, faith and fear, steel and conscience. Every crew that climbed into the sky carried that paradox with them. And as their engines thundered toward the Japanese coast, they embodied a truth that the generals below were only beginning to understand. The battlefield had risen beyond their reach, and the war had entered a dimension where no defense could stand. For Japan's military leaders, the arrival of the B-29 marked the moment when the war began to feel unwinnable. Their air defense system, designed to intercept low to mid-altitude bombers, had become obsolete overnight. In headquarters from Tokyo to Nagoya, officers pored over blueprints and aircraft performance charts, searching for a technical miracle that didn't exist. They had once believed their Zero fighters would defend the homeland as they had defended the Pacific. Now they faced an enemy that seemed to operate in another world, a silent threat from the edge of the stratosphere. The frustration ran deep. Intelligence reports described American bombers cruising far above the ceiling of the best Japanese interceptors. The guns on the ground couldn't touch them, and the radar systems, limited in range and accuracy, often lost them before they even reached their targets. The Japanese tried to respond with ingenuity born of desperation. Engineers stripped fighters of armor and radios to make them lighter. They experimented with specialized interceptors like the Ki-45 Toryu and the Ki-84 Hayate, and even attempted rocket-powered aircraft such as the Ki-200 Shusui. Each promised altitude and speed, but failed under the weight of Japan's collapsing industry. Engines overheated, fuel was scarce, and production delays crippled every innovation. Even when prototypes succeeded in tests, there were never enough to matter. The generals demanded results, but the engineers had nothing to give them except theories and fragments of hope. Inside Japan's Air Defense Command, morale eroded with each failed interception. Fighter pilots returned to base frustrated and humiliated, having spent their fuel chasing contrails that disappeared into the sun. Their commanders urged them to climb higher, to fight harder, to die if necessary. But altitude could not be conquered by courage. The B-29s operated at 30,000 feet because physics allowed it. Japan's aircraft, built for maneuverability and range in tropical climates, simply could not survive there. Every climb was a gamble against oxygen starvation and mechanical failure. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Service began to understand that bravery alone would not win this war. At the same time, the psychological impact of the Superfortress raids began to spread beyond the military. For the first time, Japanese civilians witnessed the enemy over their own cities. The high-altitude raids created an eerie phenomenon. Bright silver shapes drifting silently across blue skies, followed minutes later by the distant thunder of bombs. People stared upward, powerless to fight back, feeling the same helplessness their soldiers felt on the ground. The illusion of invulnerability, built over generations of national pride, shattered in those moments. The empire that had once advanced across Asia now trembled beneath its own sky. For the Americans, these reactions were exactly what their strategists had predicted. Air power was not just a weapon of destruction, it was a weapon of perception. The B-29 campaign aimed to prove that resistance was futile, that no matter how hard Japan fought, the war's end would come from above. Each raid carried not only bombs, but a message. The United States could reach anywhere, at any time, without challenge. In Washington and on Guam, this became a key psychological strategy. If Japan could no longer defend its homeland, its will to fight might collapse long before an invasion became necessary. Behind that strategy lay the industrial machine of the United States, a force as decisive as any battlefield victory. American factories produced thousands of aircraft each month, their assembly lines fed by limitless steel, oil, and labor. Every damaged B-29 was replaced within weeks. Spare parts, fuel, and ammunition flowed across the Pacific on convoys protected by the world's largest navy. For Japan, it was the opposite. Each interceptor lost was irreplaceable. Each gallon of aviation fuel was rationed. Each gun barrel worn out by firing into empty sky could not be replaced. The imbalance was catastrophic. By late 1944, Japan's industrial output had fallen to a fraction of its 1941 level. The war had become a contest not of courage, but of capacity, and Japan was running out of everything. Among the American crews, this knowledge came with a strange mixture of pride and unease. They knew they were part of something vast, a machine of war so large that individual lives seemed small within it. Their missions were meticulously planned, supported by intelligence, meteorology, logistics, and engineering teams numbering in the thousands. Each time they took off, they carried not just bombs, but the weight of an entire nation's effort. Yet, as they watched cities burn below, many wondered what victory would mean when it came at such a cost. Japanese society, meanwhile, was forced to adapt to constant alerts and nightly blackouts. Civilians dug air raid shelters, painted rooftops with camouflage patterns, and carried buckets of sand to fight fires. But nothing could stop the devastation that came from the stratosphere. Reports circulated of towns erased in minutes, factories flattened without warning, and entire districts reduced to ash. The government urged calm and obedience, but the people no longer believed that their army or their emperor could protect them. Fear became a permanent companion in daily life. The B-29 had turned war into something abstract and impersonal. There were no front lines, no clear battles, only distant engines and falling fire. For Japan's generals, it was a nightmare that defied every principle they had built their strategy upon. Warfare had always been about control of territory, but now territory meant nothing if the enemy could soar above it. The B-29 erased the boundaries between safety and danger, between front and rear, between soldier and civilian. It redefined the very nature of vulnerability. By the winter of 1944, even Japan's most loyal officers began to sense that the war had passed beyond their ability to influence. They could plan, command, and order sacrifice, but they could not touch the enemy who moved among the clouds. The empire's fate was now being written in vapor trails, and as those white lines stretched unbroken across the cold blue sky, one truth became inescapable. Japan's defeat was already taking shape in the silence between the engines. By November 1944, the stage was set for a new phase in the air war over Japan. The vast airfields of the Marianas were now operational, their runways filled with the hundreds of B-29 Superfortresses gleaming under the Pacific sun. The crews had trained, the logistics were in place, and the final link of supply had been forged. On November 24, 1944, the first major raid from the Marianas took off under the command of General Haywood Hansell. Their destination was Tokyo itself, the heart of the empire. It was the first time in history that enemy aircraft had reached Japan's capital in such numbers. The mission stretched across 1,500 miles of open ocean. Each aircraft carried over 10 tons of bombs and enough fuel to remain airborne for 14 hours. For many of the crews, it was their longest and most dangerous flight yet. The takeoffs alone were terrifying. The bombers lumbered down coral runways heavy with fuel, struggling to gain altitude before the end of the strip. Once airborne, they formed into long silver columns that stretched for miles, each formation bound together by radio silence and faith in navigation instruments. As they approached Japan's coastline, radar operators in Tokyo detected the incoming formation. Alarms blared. Pilots scrambled from bases around the capital, engines screaming as they climbed into the cold sky. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire blindly into the blue, their black bursts scattering far below the bombers' flight paths. Japanese spotters strained their eyes and saw the faint glimmer of sunlight on distant wings, but the bombers remained untouchable. At over 30,000 feet, they were beyond the reach of both flak and fighter. The first bombs fell over Tokyo's Nakajima aircraft engine plant. Explosions rolled across the outskirts of the city, followed by waves of incendiaries that turned factory roofs into roaring fires. Civilians huddled in shelters, confused and terrified. For months, they had heard rumors of American planes in the distance, but nothing had prepared them for this. The sound was strange. Not the low drone of medium bombers, but a deep, steady thunder that seemed to come from the heavens themselves. Above the smoke and fire, the B-29s turned for home, leaving behind a city still burning. In the Imperial General Headquarters, Officers gathered around maps as reports arrived. The damage was limited, but the implications were devastating. The Americans had reached Tokyo directly from their new bases in the Pacific, and there had been nothing Japan could do to stop them. General Hajime Sugiyama, chief of the Army General Staff, stared at the situation map in silence. His air defense network, once the pride of the empire, had proven powerless. The altitude and speed of the enemy had rendered every plan obsolete. In the days that followed, more raids came. Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe were struck. The B-29s appeared high above the cities, precise and relentless, striking industrial centers with mechanical regularity. Japanese pilots scrambled in waves, but they could rarely climb high enough to engage. Those who did found themselves facing deadly streams of .50 caliber fire from the bombers' remote-controlled turrets. Even damaged aircraft managed to limp back to base, a testament to the strength of their construction and the resources behind them. The raids had a psychological effect far beyond their physical damage. For the first time, the Japanese people saw the war not as a distant campaign, but as a personal threat. Fires burned in their neighborhoods, and the air raid sirens became a part of daily life. The government censored reports of losses but could not hide the growing fear. At night, Tokyo's skyline disappeared under blackout orders, yet everyone knew that darkness would not save them. Within the American command, however, frustration simmered. Despite the scale of their operations, the high-altitude precision strategy was yielding limited results. Strong jet streams, a phenomenon barely understood at the time, scattered bomb patterns and carried incendiaries off target. The Norden bomb site, so accurate in clear skies, became unreliable when smoke and cloud cover obscured the view. Many raids returned with disappointing photographs. Factories still standing, production only partially disrupted. General Hansel continued to insist on precision. He believed in the theory that air power could destroy Japan's war industry without targeting civilians. But Washington grew impatient. The Joint Chiefs wanted results, visible, decisive, and immediate. Behind the scenes, another figure was waiting to take control, a man whose philosophy would change the course of the bombing campaign and the fate of Japan's cities. His name was General Curtis LeMay. LeMay was a strategist of brutal efficiency. He believed that if high-altitude bombing could not break Japan, then the strategy itself had to change. He studied meteorological data, wind patterns, and fuel efficiency, searching for weaknesses in the current approach. His conclusion was radical. To destroy Japan's capacity to fight, the bombers would have to fly lower, drop incendiaries, and burn entire urban areas rather than aim for pinpoint factories. It was a plan that defied both doctrine and morality, but it promised effectiveness. As January 1945 began, the air war over Japan stood on the edge of transformation. The B-29 had already proven untouchable at altitude, a weapon that rendered Japan's defenses useless. Yet, beneath the calm order of the command centers, the next phase was being prepared, one that would trade altitude for devastation, precision for fire, and strategy for total war. The skies over Tokyo would soon glow brighter than daylight, and the sound of distant engines would become a prelude not to raids, but to infernos. By February 1945, the B-29 campaign had entered a new and terrifying phase. General Curtis LeMay had officially replaced Hansel as commander of the X-Tier-1 Bomber Command. His arrival in the Marianas brought a different kind of energy, colder, more calculating, and stripped of sentiment. LeMay was not interested in theories. He was interested in results. He studied after-action reports, weather charts, and pilot feedback, and he saw what no one else had dared to accept. Precision bombing at high altitude was failing. The Japanese war machine was still functioning, its factories still producing, its will to fight unbroken. LeMay's solution would change the face of warfare forever. He ordered a complete shift in tactics. The B-29s would abandon their lofty safe heights and strike at night. low, fast, and loaded with incendiary bombs instead of high-explosive ordnance. The new weapons were designed to ignite Japan's wooden cities, where homes stood shoulder to shoulder and narrow streets funneled wind through flammable neighborhoods. If precision could not break Japan, fire would. It was not a strategy of accuracy, but of annihilation. When the orders went out, many air crews were stunned. They had trained for high-altitude bombing, relying on advanced optics and tight formations. Now, they would be flying under 8,000 feet, directly through enemy flak and searchlights, with no defensive escort. It sounded like suicide, one pilot later recalled. But LeMay's cold logic was unshakable. At that altitude, the jet stream would be gone, bombing would be more consistent, and Japanese night defenses were weak. The risk was worth the potential destruction. On the night of March 9, 1945, Operation Meeting House began. Over 300 B-29s took off from Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, their bellies filled with clusters of M69 incendiaries, small, napalm-filled bombs that would burst upon impact and spread liquid fire through streets and buildings. The first formation reached Tokyo just before midnight. The weather was perfect for fire, dry, windy, and cold. At 12:08 a.m., the first bomb bays opened. In seconds, the city below was lit with orange streaks as thousands of incendiaries rained down. They pierced roofs, rolled into attics, and exploded into sheets of flame. Within minutes, the fires merged into massive whirlwinds that sucked in oxygen and created their own weather. Winds reached hurricane strength. Entire blocks vanished into spirals of smoke and sparks. People ran through the streets, clutching their children, blinded by the smoke, their screams drowned by the roar of the firestorm. From above, the crews could see it all. The glow of the burning city rose into the sky like a sunrise. The air shimmered with heat so intense that it tossed the heavy bombers like toys. It looked as if the city was melting, one gunner whispered later. In Tokyo's working-class districts, wooden homes turned into furnaces. Rivers boiled. Firemen collapsed from exhaustion and smoke. Thousands jumped into canals, only to suffocate as the fires consumed the air above the water. By dawn, Tokyo was a wasteland. Over 100,000 people were dead, and more than 1 million were homeless. The next morning, LeMay received the mission reports. Few aircraft had been lost, an outcome that astonished even his most skeptical officers. The destruction, however, was beyond comprehension. The photographs taken from reconnaissance planes revealed a city flattened to ashes, its neighborhoods erased from the map. For LeMay, it was confirmation. "This," he said coldly, "is how we'll finish the war." The raids continued night after night. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. Each city followed the same fate. The B-29s came in waves, their incendiaries igniting new infernos across Japan. The glow of the fires was visible for miles at sea. Crews grew numb, operating on routine rather than conscience. The smell of burning cities clung to their uniforms even after they returned to base. For them, the war had become mechanical, a cycle of flight, fire, and silence. In Tokyo, survivors wandered through the ruins in disbelief. Entire families had vanished. Train stations were filled with the displaced and the wounded. The Imperial Palace itself had been scarred by falling debris. Japanese radio broadcasts tried to maintain morale, claiming the bombings only strengthened national unity. But within the military command, despair was spreading. Generals knew their air defenses were powerless. Even the most experienced FIG-H pilots admitted they could no longer reach the B-29s when they returned to high altitude. Japan's war industry was collapsing under the weight of fire and fear. Still, no one dared to surrender. The Code of Bushido demanded resistance to the end. The emperor's ministers argued over how to continue the fight, but the truth was inescapable. The enemy could now strike anywhere, at any time. The home islands were no longer sanctuaries, but targets. LeMay, meanwhile, was preparing the next stage. He wanted to cripple Japan's transportation and communication networks entirely, cutting off food and supplies. Yet even as his bombers burned one city after another weapon was being prepared in secret, one far more powerful than fire. The B-29s would soon become the carriers of a weapon the world had never seen before, one that would bring the war, and Japan's suffering, to its final, unbearable conclusion. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a nation burning from within. The once mighty empire stretched thin across the Pacific now existed under a constant veil of smoke. Entire industrial centers had vanished, and the urban population had no shelter left to hide beneath. Millions wandered the countryside, homeless, starving, and disoriented. The American B-29s, now striking with impunity, had erased the boundaries between the front and the homeland. Yet in Tokyo's inner chambers, the Supreme War Council refused to yield. For Japan's generals, surrender was unthinkable, a humiliation worse than death. General Curtis LeMay understood this defiance better than anyone. His bombers had turned the great cities into ashes, but Japan still fought on. It wasn't just infrastructure he needed to destroy now. It was morale, the belief that resistance still mattered. And so, in June 1945, the B-29s began a new phase of total war. They targeted transportation hubs, rail lines, food depots, and ports, ensuring starvation would accompany fire. The campaign no longer distinguished between soldiers and civilians. It was the systematic dismantling of a nation's ability to survive. By mid-July, Tokyo was surrounded by ruins. The Imperial Army still mustered divisions, but without fuel or ammunition, they were ghost formations. Even the once feared kamikaze pilots were running out of aircraft and gasoline. Japan's airfields lay in shambles, their runways cratered and their hangars twisted skeletons. B-29 crews now flew missions almost without opposition. Radar screens aboard their Superfortresses showed empty skies. The Japanese fighter presence, once a deadly threat, had become nearly invisible. The war had become one-sided, mechanical, inevitable. And yet, deep beneath the surface, in laboratories half a world away, another kind of weapon was nearing completion. In New Mexico, at a desert site known as Trinity, American scientists under the Manhattan Project had succeeded in harnessing the destructive force of atomic energy. The first nuclear explosion lit the horizon brighter than the sun, and its shockwave rolled across the sands with unimaginable power. News of the success reached Washington within hours, and from there, to the airbases of the Pacific. The B-29 was the only aircraft capable of carrying such a weapon across an ocean. Specially modified B-29s, known as silver plate bombers, were selected for the mission. Their bomb bays were altered, their armor lightened, and there, our crews trained in utmost secrecy. Among them was a plane named Enola Gay, under the command of Colonel Paul Tibbets. The crew understood they were preparing for something unprecedented, but even they could not fully grasp the scale of what they were about to unleash. In Tokyo, Japanese military intelligence intercepted fragments of radio chatter hinting at a new kind of weapon, but no one believed it. How could a single bomb do more damage than the 1,000 plane raids that had already flattened their cities? They dismissed the rumors as psychological warfare. Yet in Washington and on the island of Tinian, final orders were being signed. President Harry Truman had authorized the use of the atomic bomb to end the war quickly and avoid an invasion of Japan's home islands. An invasion expected to cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and perhaps millions of Japanese. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay took off from Tinian's North Field at 2:45 a.m. It climbed into the night sky, heading northwest across the Pacific. Inside, the bomb codenamed Little Boy rested in its cradle. A 9,700-pound cylinder of uranium capable of vaporizing an entire city. At 8:15 a.m., after 6 hours of flight, the crew sighted their target, Hiroshima. The city lay calm beneath broken clouds, unaware that its final morning had begun. The bomb fell silently for 43 seconds. Then the world changed. A flash brighter than lightning engulfed the sky. A sphere of fire 1,000 feet wide erupted over the city, followed by a shockwave that flattened everything within miles. The temperature beneath the blast soared to nearly 4,000 degrees Celsius. Asphalt melted. Shadows burned into walls. Tens of thousands of people vanished in an instant. Their existence reduced to outlines scorched into stone. Within minutes, Hiroshima was unrecognizable, a churning sea of flame and dust. 3 days later, a second B-29, Boxcar, lifted off from Tinian, carrying another bomb, this one called Fat Man. Its target was Nagasaki. The mission was delayed by weather, but at 11:02 a.m. on August 9th, the bomb fell. Another flash. Another city gone. The reports reached Tokyo within hours. Emperor Hirohito's generals were speechless. They had spent months watching cities burn. But this was different. The damage was not caused by thousands of bombers, but by one. No air raid could be intercepted. No flak could reach that high. And no defense existed for such power. Japan's scientists confirmed what many refused to believe. It was atomic. Humanity had entered a new era of warfare, and Japan was its first victim. In an emergency meeting the next day, the war cabinet faced the truth. Even the most hardline generals, those who once swore to fight to the last man, fell silent. Their air force was gone. Their navy lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Their cities were ashes, and now even their atmosphere offered no safety. The skies that once symbolized Japan's proud empire had become the domain of its destruction. Above it all, the B-29s still flew. Silver giants moving effortlessly through thin blue air. They no longer faced pursuit or challenge. The empire beneath them was finished, though it had not yet spoken the words of surrender. But those words were coming, carried on the silence that followed the last bombs. In the days after Nagasaki, Japan's silence became heavier than any explosion. The country lay in ruins, but the machinery of war still lingered, battered, confused, and waiting for orders that would never come. The once proud imperial general headquarters sat in dim rooms, its maps meaningless beneath flickering lights. Radio operators listened to static instead of commands. The emperor's ministers spoke in low voices, their faces pale with exhaustion and disbelief. They had lost everything, their armies, their fleets, their skies, and now, even the illusion of control. On August 10th, a message was sent to Switzerland and Sweden, neutral intermediaries for diplomatic communication. It was Japan's first signal that it sought to end the war. But even that message was cautious, almost hesitant. It asked for peace under the condition that the emperor's sovereignty be preserved, a final attempt to protect the divine symbol of the nation. In Washington and London, the response was firm. The Allies would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender, though they hinted the emperor could remain as a figurehead if he renounced his divinity. The message reached Tokyo the next day. The generals argued through the night. Some wanted to keep fighting, believing the United States must have exhausted its atomic stockpile. Others, led by Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, knew the truth. Even one more bomb would mean annihilation. Meanwhile, the B-29s did not rest. Hundreds continued to fly daily missions, dropping leaflets instead of bombs. The messages warned of destruction, urging civilians to flee before their cities vanished. But there was nowhere left to run. Japan's infrastructure had collapsed. Rail lines lay twisted in craters. Bridges were destroyed, and food convoys no longer moved. Disease spread through refugee camps. Children scavenged for water in bombed-out streets. The empire had become a landscape of ashes and whispers. Then, on August 12th, another signal came. Not from the Americans, but from the Soviet Union. The Red Army had invaded Manchuria, crushing Japan's last remaining army group in a matter of days. Over 1 million Japanese soldiers were captured or killed. Whatever slim hope remained for negotiation was gone. Japan was encircled by enemies, its empire erased, its people starving. The air itself had turned hostile. Inside the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito faced the reality his generals could not. On August 14th, he made the most consequential decision of his reign. For the first time in history, a Japanese emperor would address his nation directly. His words were carefully chosen, calm yet devastating in their finality. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, he said in his recorded broadcast. We have resolved to pave the way for a great peace by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. When the recording aired the next day, the nation stopped. People gathered around radios in the ruins of their homes. Many could not believe what they were hearing. The voice of the emperor, surrendering. Others wept quietly, not out of shame, but exhaustion. For them, the war had lasted too long, taken too much. Far above, in the calm skies that once belonged to the B-29s, the engines finally quieted. The great bombers began to return home, their missions complete. On the island of Tinian, crews watched the news unfold through brief radio reports. There was no celebration, no cheers, only relief, and the slow realization of what they had done. Many had flown dozens of missions without ever seeing the people below. Now they saw the photo, graphs, the flattened cities, the burned streets, the shadows etched into stone. Some justified it as necessary. Others carried the weight silently for the rest of their lives. For Japan, surrender was not an ending, but a beginning of reckoning. The occupation that followed would strip away the old order. Factories that once built aircraft would produce tools and bicycles. Airfields once filled with Zeros became civilian runways. The empire that had risen through steel and fire was reborn through humility and reconstruction. Yet, amid that transformation, the memory of the B-29 remained. A silver ghost above the clouds, a reminder of the moment when war left the earth and conquered the sky. When Japan's formal surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, the world exhaled for the first time in 6 years. The war that had begun with surprise attacks and desperate defenses ended beneath an open sky. Quiet, almost sacred. American B-29s circled overhead during the ceremony, not as bombers but as guardians, symbols of the air supremacy that had brought the conflict to its final halt. Their presence reminded everyone below that the age of battleships and bayonets was over. From now on, wars would be decided by altitude, speed, and reach. For Japan, defeat came with humiliation, but also a strange, fragile clarity. In the weeks after surrender, Allied occupation forces moved swiftly to dismantle what remained of the military infrastructure. Runways that once launched interceptors against the B-29s were filled with craters and left to the weeds. Factories that once forged aircraft parts now stood silent, their assembly lines covered in dust. The Japanese pilots who had once scrambled to reach impossible heights returned home as laborers and mechanics, their wings clipped not by bullets, but by history itself. American investigators toured the wreckage of Japan's air defense network. They studied the anti-aircraft guns, the radar systems, the captured fighters that never managed to climb high enough to intercept the Superfortress. Their reports all concluded the same thing. Japan had been fighting a war it was technologically unequipped to win. The industrial might of the United States, its resources, manpower, and scientific innovation had simply outpaced anything Japan could produce. The B-29 campaign, they wrote, was not only a military victory, but a demonstration of industrial civilization's full potential for destruction. But beneath that victory lay something darker. Many of the men who flew the B-29s came home haunted. They had seen the world from 30,000 feet, detached and safe. But what they dropped from those altitudes had erased millions of lives. Some struggled to reconcile the necessity of the missions with the enormity of the suffering. Pilots who had watched Tokyo burn could still smell the smoke years later. Crews who delivered the atomic bombs spoke of silence. Not pride, not triumph, just silence. Curtis LeMay, the architect of the firebombing strategy, faced both admiration and condemnation. His campaign had ended the war faster, many argued, saving countless lives that would have been lost in an invasion. But others saw it differently. As the dawn of total warfare, where civilians and soldiers alike were consumed in the same inferno. LeMay himself never apologized. "If we had lost," he once said bluntly, "we'd all have been tried as war criminals." His words reflected the brutal logic of that era. Victory justified everything. For Japan's survivors, the scars were permanent. Cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya rebuilt from nothing, yet the memories of those nights never faded. Museums rose where fire once fell. Testimonies from survivors, the hibakusha, became moral anchors for generations that followed, warning of what happens when technology outpaces humanity. The sight of a B-29, once a symbol of terror, slowly transformed into an emblem of remembrance, its silhouette preserved in museums, its engines silent but eternal. Globally, the lessons of the B-29 era reshaped warfare forever. The airplane that had once dominated the skies over Japan became the blueprint for the next generation of bombers. The B-47, B-52, and beyond. Nations across the world studied the campaign and drew their own conclusions. That control of the air meant control of the outcome. In the Cold War that followed, the shadow of the B-29 lingered. In jet bombers, in missiles, and in the new concept of deterrence through overwhelming power. Yet for all its military significance, the legacy of the B-29 remained deeply human. It was a machine of precision and endurance, but also a symbol of contradiction, a creation of human genius that brought both victory and tragedy. The Japanese generals who once stared helplessly at the bombers above their reach had lived to see their country reborn beneath American occupation. The skies that had once burned with fire became peaceful again, filled with cargo planes, passenger jets, and clouds instead of contrails of war. When the last B-29s were retired from service, many were left in rusting fields or turned into monuments. On quiet days, wind still moves through their hollow frames like the breath of history itself. A whisper from the age when altitude became invincibility, and when human ambition finally outclimbed its own conscience. When the smoke of war finally cleared and the world began to rebuild, the image of the B-29 remained suspended in memory, a silver giant gliding above clouds that no longer hid an enemy. It was more than a machine. It was a symbol of humanity's greatest contradiction, the power to create something magnificent, only to use it for unimaginable destruction. The Japanese generals who once looked up helplessly toward those unreachable bombers had witnessed the end of an era. Their empire had sought to dominate the Pacific through courage and will, but it was defeated by altitude, industry, and science. The B-29 represented the point where warfare transcended the human scale. Battles were no longer fought face to face. They were waged between minds, between engineers and factories, between those who could build higher and fly farther. In the ruins of Tokyo, amid the twisted steel and burned earth, Japan's future was already beginning. The same discipline and determination that once fueled its war machine were now channeled into rebuilding. In just a generation, Japan transformed from a shattered empire into a nation of innovation and peace. Its cities rose again, modern and alive, beneath the same sky that had once carried its destruction. For the men who built and flew the B-29, history would judge them with complexity. Some would be remembered as heroes, others as harbingers of a new kind of horror. Yet all shared the same truth. They had witnessed the birth of modern warfare. The thin air they once flew through became the frontier of every conflict that followed, from Korea to Vietnam to the nuclear standoff of the Cold War. The story of the B-29 is not just about victory or defeat. It is about the moment humanity realized how small the world had become and how far its reach could extend. In the silence above 30,000 feet, where the Earth curved gently below and the horizon met eternity, the B-29s carried more than bombs. They carried the weight of a new age, an age where mankind had finally conquered the sky, but at the cost of its innocence.